Picture this. You're sitting in what you think is just another boring team meeting, watching your boss crack jokes in a foreign language with the visiting executives, completely unaware that you understand every single word they're saying about your future at the company. That's exactly what happened to me 3 months ago. And what I discovered that day changed everything about how I saw my workplace, my career, and ultimately led to the most satisfying moment of professional revenge I've ever experienced. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Jessica Parker, and I've been working as a marketing coordinator at Meridian Tech Solutions in Austin, Texas for the past 4 years. It's one of those mid-sized companies that likes to think it's cutting edge, but still operates like it's stuck in 2015. The kind of place where they have a ping pong table in the break room that nobody's allowed to use during work hours, and where casual Friday means you can wear dark jeans instead of black slacks. I'd always been what you'd call a model employee. Never late, always met my deadlines, volunteered for extra projects, and somehow managed to maintain a smile even when dealing with the most demanding clients. My performance reviews were consistently excellent, and I'd received 2 small promotions since starting there. Nothing spectacular, mind you, just enough to keep me hopeful that I was building something meaningful. The thing about me that nobody at work knew was that I'm fluent in Mandarin. Not just conversational level, I mean truly fluent. My mother is Chinese American, and she insisted I learn the language properly from childhood. I spent 2 summers in Beijing during college, and I'd kept up with it over the years through online communities and Chinese media. It wasn't something I broadcast at work because, honestly, it had never seemed relevant to my job in marketing for a Texas-based tech company. My boss, Derek Mitchell, was the kind of middle manager who thought he was much more important than he actually was. He was in his early 40s, always wore suits that were just slightly too expensive for his salary range, and had this habit of name-dropping clients and connections to make himself sound more influential. Derek had joined the company about 18 months after I did, brought in from some startup in California that had apparently gone under. He'd made it clear from day one that he intended to modernize our department and bring in fresh perspectives. The first sign that something was changing came when Derek announced that Meridian Tech was pursuing a major partnership with a Chinese technology firm called Golden Dragon Industries. This was supposed to be huge for us, a multi-million-dollar deal that would expand our services into the Asian market. Derek was practically vibrating with excitement about it, clearly seeing this as his ticket to a bigger role in the company. What made this particularly interesting was that Derek had apparently been taking Mandarin lessons for the past 6 months, in preparation for this partnership. He'd mention it casually in meetings, talking about how challenging the language was, but how committed he was to building authentic relationships with our Chinese partners. He'd even started throwing around basic Mandarin phrases in the office, usually getting the tones completely wrong, which made me cringe internally every time. The Golden Dragon Industries executives were scheduled to visit our Austin office for a week-long series of meetings and presentations. This was being treated as the most important week in our company's recent history. Our CEO, Patricia Holloway, had mandated that everything had to be perfect. The office was deep cleaned, new furniture was brought in for the conference rooms, and there was even talk of hiring a translator, though Derek insisted that wouldn't be necessary since he was practically conversational now. I was assigned to handle all the marketing materials for the presentations, which meant I'd be working closely with Derek and attending most of the meetings. This wasn't unusual. I'd always been his go-to person for important projects, probably because I actually got things done without creating drama or needing constant hand-holding. The week before the Chinese executives arrived, Derek's behavior started to shift in ways that made me uncomfortable. He began making subtle comments about streamlining operations and maximizing efficiency. During our departmental meeting, he mentioned that the company was looking at right-sizing various departments based on the new partnership requirements. When someone asked what that meant, he just smiled and said we'd discuss specific changes after the Golden Dragon meetings were concluded. I started paying closer attention to the conversations happening around me, and I noticed that Derek was having a lot of private meetings with HR and upper management. There were hushed conversations that stopped when other employees walked by, and I caught him reviewing personnel files that he'd quickly close whenever someone entered his office. The Friday before the big week, Derek called me into his office for what he said was a strategic planning session. He closed the door and sat across from his desk with an expression that was trying to be serious, but came across as self-important. "Jessica," he began, "I want you to know that you've been an invaluable asset to this team. Your work on the Golden Dragon materials has been exceptional, and I've made sure that upper management is aware of your contributions." Something about the way he said it felt off. There was a but coming. I could sense it. "However," he continued, "we're entering a new phase for this company. The partnership with Golden Dragon is going to require us to think differently about our staffing needs and organizational structure. Some positions may become redundant, while others will need to evolve significantly." I kept my expression neutral, but my stomach was starting to knot up. "What exactly does that mean for the marketing department?" Derek leaned back in his chair, trying to look thoughtful. "Well, that's still being determined. A lot will depend on how next week goes and what Golden Dragon's expectations are for our ongoing collaboration. I just wanted you to be aware that changes are coming, and I wanted to give you a heads up to start thinking about how you might want to position yourself for whatever comes next." It was the kind of corporate non-answer that said everything and nothing at the same time. I left his office feeling uneasy, but not entirely sure why. Looking back, I think Derek was testing the waters, seeing how I'd react to the suggestion that my job might be in jeopardy. The weekend passed slowly. I found myself researching Golden Dragon Industries online, trying to understand what this partnership might really mean for our company. What I found was interesting. Golden Dragon was significantly larger than Meridian Tech, with a reputation for acquiring smaller companies rather than just partnering with them. Their partnerships often seem to result in major restructuring of the smaller company's operations. Monday morning arrived with an energy in the office that felt like a mix of excitement and anxiety. The Golden Dragon executives were scheduled to arrive around 10 a.m., and Derek had been in the office since 7, frantically reviewing presentation materials and practicing his Mandarin pronunciation in his office. I could hear him through the walls, butchering tones and getting basic sentence structures wrong. The Chinese delegation consisted of 3 executives: Mr. Chen Wei, who appeared to be the lead decision-maker, Ms. Liu Mei, who handled technical specifications, and Mr. Wang Jian, who seemed focused on financial aspects. They were all impeccably dressed and carried themselves with the quiet confidence that comes from representing a company with serious resources. Derek greeted them in the lobby with what he clearly thought was impressive Mandarin, but I could tell from their polite smiles that his pronunciation was painful to listen to. They responded in perfect English, which should have been Derek's first clue that his language skills weren't going to be the asset he thought they were. The first day of meetings went smoothly enough. I presented the marketing materials I'd prepared, focusing on how Meridian Tech's services could complement Golden Dragon's existing offerings. The Chinese executives asked thoughtful questions and seemed genuinely interested in the potential partnership. Derek inserted himself into every conversation, often repeating points I'd already made, but acting as if he was providing crucial insights. During lunch, which was held in our main conference room, I noticed that the Chinese executives occasionally spoke to each other in Mandarin. Nothing unusual about that. It's natural for people to communicate in their native language when discussing complex business matters. Derek clearly noticed too, because he kept trying to catch fragments of their conversation and would nod knowingly, as if he understood what they were saying. What Derek didn't realize was that I understood every word. Their conversations during that first day were exactly what you'd expect. technical discussions about integration possibilities, questions about our company's financial stability, and assessments of our team's capabilities. Nothing particularly revealing, but I found myself in the strange position of being the only person in the room who could follow both the English and Chinese conversations happening simultaneously. Tuesday's meetings focused on technical specifications and implementation timelines. This was where Ms. Lu Mei took the lead, and her questions were sharp and detailed. She wanted to understand not just what we could deliver, but how we could deliver it, and whether we had the resources to scale up if the partnership expanded. During a break, I overheard Mr. Chen and Mr. Wang discussing our office setup and team structure. Mr. Chen commented that our operation seemed smaller than what their research had indicated, and Mr. Wang noted that our staffing levels might not be sufficient for the kind of volume they were considering. It wasn't necessarily negative, but it was clear they were evaluating whether we could handle a major partnership. Derek spent most of Tuesday trying to impress them with his limited Mandarin vocabulary. He'd throw in basic phrases like "hen hao," "very good," and "zizi, thank you," at random moments, clearly hoping to demonstrate his cultural sensitivity. The Chinese executives remained polite, but I could see they were more amused than impressed. That evening, Derek called me into his office again. He was practically glowing with what he perceived as success. "I think it's going incredibly well," he said, loosening his tie. "They're clearly impressed with our capabilities, and I can tell they appreciate the effort I've made to learn their language. Mr. Chen even complimented my pronunciation. I was pretty sure Mr. Chen had done no such thing, but I just nodded and agreed that the meeting seemed positive. Tomorrow's the big day," Derek continued. "They're going to present their partnership proposal, and we'll get into the real details about how this collaboration would work. I have a feeling this is going to change everything for us." He wasn't wrong about that, though not in the way he expected. Wednesday morning started with Derek in an even more elevated mood. He'd apparently gotten some kind of encouraging feedback from upper management about how the meetings were progressing, and he was convinced that the Golden Dragon partnership was practically a done deal. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The morning session was scheduled to cover financial projections and resource allocation. This was Mr. Wang's area of expertise, and his presentation was thorough and professional. He outlined various scenarios for how the partnership might develop, from basic service agreements to more integrated collaborations. What became clear during his presentation was that Golden Dragon was thinking much bigger than what Derek had initially described to us. They weren't just looking for a marketing partner. They were considering a comprehensive business relationship that would involve significant changes to how we operated. During the lunch break, I was in the break room getting coffee when I heard Derek on a phone call in his office. His door was slightly open, and he was talking to someone, I assumed upper management, about the meetings. No, it's going perfectly," he was saying. "They're definitely going to move forward with the partnership. Mr. Chen told me privately that they're very impressed with our setup and our team's capabilities. I think we're looking at a major expansion opportunity here." I'd been in all the same meetings as Derek, and I hadn't heard Mr. Chen say anything like that. If anything, the Chinese executives had been professional but cautious in their assessments. It seemed like Derek was either misinterpreting their politeness as enthusiasm or deliberately overselling the situation to his superiors. The afternoon session was when things started to get really interesting. Mr. Chen took the lead and began discussing what Golden Dragon would need from a long-term partner. His presentation covered everything from technical capabilities to staffing requirements to cultural compatibility. About halfway through his presentation, Mr. Chen began switching between English and Mandarin, using his native language to provide additional context and nuance to certain points. Derek nodded along as if he understood, occasionally throwing in one of his practiced phrases. That's when I heard something that made my blood run cold. Mr. Chen was explaining to Ms. Liu and Mr. Wang in Mandarin that while Meridian Tech had some useful capabilities, their team seemed bloated for the actual work that would be required. He specifically mentioned that many of the current staff positions would be redundant in a true partnership scenario, and that Golden Dragon would expect significant workforce optimization as part of any agreement. Ms. Liu responded that this was typical for partnerships with smaller American companies, and that staffing adjustments were usually necessary to achieve the efficiency levels Golden Dragon expected. Derek sat there smiling and nodding, completely oblivious to the fact that they were discussing eliminating most of his department. But it got worse. Mr. Wang then mentioned, still in Mandarin, that he'd been impressed with the marketing materials and presentations, particularly the work that the young woman had done. He suggested that the partnership would probably require keeping only the essential personnel who had demonstrated real competence. Mr. Chen agreed, adding that based on their observations, the department could probably function with about half its current staff, as long as they retained the people who were actually doing the substantive work. I sat there trying to keep my expression neutral while processing what I was hearing. The Chinese executives were essentially planning to gut our department, keeping only a few key people, and Derek, who was supposed to be protecting his team, was sitting there completely unaware of what was being discussed literally right in front of him. The meeting continued with Mr. Chen switching back to English to discuss implementation timelines. Derek jumped in with questions about his role in the expanded partnership, clearly envisioning himself in some kind of elevated position overseeing the collaboration. Mr. Chen's responses were diplomatic, but vague, which should have been another warning sign for Derek. When someone asks about their future role and gets non-committal answers about evolving responsibilities and organizational flexibility, that's usually not a good sign. After the Chinese executives left for the day, Derek was practically bouncing off the walls with excitement. He gathered the entire marketing team for an impromptu meeting to share what he called incredible news. "I can't give you all the details yet," he announced, "but I can tell you that this partnership is going to transform our department." Golden Dragon is thinking about a level of collaboration that goes far beyond what we initially imagined. There are going to be opportunities for growth and advancement that we never could have anticipated. He went on like this for another 10 minutes, painting a picture of expansion and opportunity that bore no resemblance to what I'd actually heard in the meeting. My colleagues looked excited and optimistic, and I felt sick knowing what was really being planned. That evening, I went home and spent hours thinking about what I should do with the information I had. Part of me wanted to warn my colleagues immediately, but I also knew that without proof, it would just be my word against Derek's interpretation of the meetings. And there was still a chance I'd misunderstood something, though I was pretty confident in my comprehension of what had been said. I decided to wait and see what happened in Thursday's meetings. If the pattern continued, I'd figure out how to address it. But I was already starting to formulate a plan for how to handle Derek's complete incompetence and the betrayal of his team's trust. Thursday morning arrived with Derek in an even more elevated state. He'd apparently had dinner with some of the upper management the night before, and whatever they discussed had convinced him that his future with the company was not just secure, but bright. The Thursday meetings were focused on finalizing the partnership framework and discussing next steps. This was when the real details were supposed to emerge, and I was curious to see how Derek would react when the reality of the situation became clearer. But what happened that morning exceeded even my worst expectations for how badly Derek had misread the entire situation. Thursday's first meeting began with what Derek clearly thought would be his moment of triumph. He'd prepared an elaborate presentation about synergistic opportunities and cross-cultural collaboration excellence. The PowerPoint was full of buzzwords and corporate speak that made me cringe, but Derek presented it with the confidence of someone who believed he was delivering groundbreaking insights. The Chinese executives listened politely, occasionally, taking notes, but their body language suggested they were going through the motions rather than being genuinely engaged. When Derek finished his presentation and asked for their thoughts, Mr. Chen simply said it was very comprehensive and suggested they move on to discussing practical implementation details. That's when the real conversation began, and it wasn't happening in English. Mr. Chen started by asking Ms. Liu in Mandarin whether she'd completed her assessment of the current staffing structure. She confirmed that she had, and began detailing her analysis of each department member's actual contribution to the work they'd observed over the past few days. Her assessment was brutally honest. She described Derek as enthusiastic but lacking in substantive understanding of either the technical or strategic aspects of the work. She noted that he seemed to take credit for work that was clearly being done by others, particularly the woman who created the marketing materials. Mr. Wang chimed in, saying that in his experience, American middle managers like Derek were often the biggest obstacle to efficient operations in partnerships like this. He suggested that the ideal scenario would be to work around Derek entirely, dealing directly with the people who actually understood the work. Derek sat there nodding and smiling, occasionally interjecting with comments like, "I'm glad we're all on the same page," and "This is exactly the kind of strategic thinking that's going to make this partnership successful." Meanwhile, I was learning that my job was probably safe, but that most of my colleagues weren't going to be so lucky. Ms. Liu was methodically going through each person in our department, categorizing them as either essential, potentially useful, or redundant. The essential category included me and 2 other colleagues. Everyone else, including Derek, fell into the redundant category. But the most shocking revelation came when Mr. Chen began discussing the timeline for these changes. He mentioned that Golden Dragon preferred to implement workforce optimization quickly after partnerships were finalized, usually within the first 6 months. He suggested that the best approach would be to identify the key personnel they wanted to retain and then allow the current management structure to handle the transition process. In other words, they were planning to let Derek fire his own team, not realizing that he was also on the chopping block. The morning session concluded with Mr. Chen announcing that they'd like to spend the afternoon in individual meetings with key personnel to better understand the specific capabilities and perspectives of the team members. Derek immediately volunteered to coordinate these meetings and suggested that he sit in on all of them to provide context. Mr. Chen politely declined, explaining that they preferred one-on-one conversations to get unfiltered insights. Derek looked slightly disappointed but agreed, probably thinking this was just a cultural preference rather than a deliberate attempt to get information without his interference. I was scheduled for the second individual meeting of the afternoon, after my colleague Marcus from the digital marketing team. As I waited in the small conference room, I could hear Derek in his office making phone calls, presumably updating upper management on what he perceived as continued success. When Mr. Chen and Ms. Liu entered for my meeting, I made a decision. That would change everything. Instead of pretending I didn't understand Mandarin, I decided to test the waters. "Thank you for taking the time to meet with me individually," I said in English, then added in perfect Mandarin. "I hope our previous meetings have given you a clear picture of our capabilities." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Both executives stopped in their tracks, and I could see the surprise and recognition in their eyes. Mr. Chen recovered first, responding in Mandarin. "Your pronunciation is excellent. Where did you learn to speak Chinese?" I explained my background, my mother's heritage, and my studies in Beijing. As we talked, I could see them recalibrating their entire assessment of the situation. Here was someone who not only understood their language, but had been sitting silently through 3 days of meetings where they'd discussed confidential strategic plans, thinking no one else could understand. Ms. Liu asked directly, "How much of our previous conversations have you understood?" I decided to be completely honest. "Everything, including your discussions about staffing optimization and workforce reduction." There was a long pause. Mr. Chen leaned back in his chair, and I could see him processing the implications of what I just revealed. Finally, he asked, "And what do you think about what you've heard?" This was my moment, and I knew I had to handle it carefully. "I think there's a significant disconnect between what your company needs and what our current management understands about this partnership. I also think there are ways to achieve your efficiency goals without the kind of disruption that might damage the working relationships you'll need for long-term success." We spent the next hour in a conversation that was unlike any business meeting I'd ever been part of. They asked detailed questions about the actual work processes in our department, who really did what, and how things might be restructured more strategically. I was honest about the challenges and inefficiencies in our current setup, but I also made it clear that some of the people they were considering redundant were actually valuable contributors who were just being poorly managed. Toward the end of our meeting, Mr. Chen asked me directly, "If you were designing a partnership structure that would work for both companies, what would it look like?" I outlined a plan that would retain more of the current staff, but reorganize the management structure to eliminate redundancies and improve efficiency. I suggested that the real problem wasn't the number of people, but the way responsibilities were distributed and overseen. Ms. Liu was taking notes throughout this conversation, and I could tell they were genuinely interested in my perspective. When our meeting concluded, Mr. Chen said something that made my heart race. "We may want to continue this conversation tomorrow, after we've completed all the individual meetings." As I left the conference room, I saw Derek hovering near his office, clearly curious about how my meeting had gone. "How did it go?" he asked with that fake casual tone people use when they're fishing for information. "Fine," I said. They asked about my experience with the marketing materials and some technical questions about our processes. Derek nodded, seeming satisfied with this non-answer. Good, good. I'm sure they were impressed. Did they mention anything about the partnership structure or timeline?" "Not really," I lied. "It was pretty focused on day-to-day operational stuff." The rest of the afternoon continued with individual meetings. I could see other colleagues coming and going from the small conference room, each looking thoughtful, or slightly confused when they emerged. Derek continued to hover, trying to get read on how things were going, but everyone gave him similarly vague responses. That evening, I had trouble sleeping. I kept thinking about the conversation with Mr. Chen and Ms. Liu and what it might mean for my career and my colleagues' futures. I'd essentially positioned myself as someone who understood both the American and Chinese perspectives on the partnership, but I wasn't sure what they planned to do with that information. Friday morning arrived with a different energy in the office. This was supposed to be the final day of meetings, when the Chinese executives would present their final assessment and partnership proposal. Derek was practically vibrating with anticipation, convinced that he was about to hear confirmation of his success. The morning session was scheduled as a comprehensive review, with all the key stakeholders present. Our CEO, Patricia Holloway, joined the meeting, along with the head of HR and the chief financial officer. Derek had positioned himself prominently at the conference table, clearly expecting to play a central role in whatever announcement was coming. Mr. Chen began with a presentation that summarized Golden Dragon's assessment of the partnership opportunity. He spoke about Meridian Tech's capabilities, market position, and potential for growth. Everything he said was positive but carefully neutral, the kind of language that could be interpreted optimistic or pessimistic depending on your perspective. Derek was interpreting everything optimistically, nodding enthusiastically and occasionally adding comments like, "Exactly what we've been working toward," and "This aligns perfectly with our strategic vision." But then Mr. Chen shifted into what he called implementation considerations, and this is where things got interesting. He began discussing the organizational changes that would be necessary to make the partnership successful, speaking primarily in English, but occasionally switching to Mandarin for what appeared to be clarifications with his colleagues. What Derek didn't realize was that the Mandarin clarifications were actually the real substance of what they were proposing. In English, Mr. Chen talked about optimizing organizational efficiency. In Mandarin, he specified that this meant reducing the marketing department from 8 people to 4, eliminating the current management layer, and restructuring reporting relationships. Derek continued to nod along, even when Mr. Chen mentioned that the partnership would require new approaches to leadership and oversight. In Mandarin, Mr. Chen clarified that they would need to work with someone who had both cultural understanding and practical competence, rather than relying on the current management structure. The meeting concluded with Mr. Chen announcing that Golden Dragon was prepared to move forward with the partnership, pending some final organizational adjustments. He suggested that they'd provide a detailed implementation plan by the following week, outlining the specific changes that would be necessary. Derek was ecstatic. As soon as the Chinese executives left the conference room, he started shaking hands with everyone and talking about what a successful week it had been. "I think we really impressed them," he kept saying. "This is going to be transformative for all of us." Patricia Holloway seemed pleased but more cautious. She mentioned that they'd need to review the detailed implementation plan carefully before making any final commitments. But Derek was already talking about celebration dinners and planning sessions for the expanded operations. That afternoon, I received an unexpected email asking me to meet with Mr. Chen privately before the Chinese delegation left for the airport. The message was brief and didn't specify what the meeting was about, but I had a feeling it was connected to our conversation from the previous day. I found Mr. Chen in the small conference room, reviewing documents on his laptop. He looked up when I entered and gestured for me to sit down. "I wanted to speak with you once more before we leave," he said in Mandarin. "Our conversation yesterday was very enlightening, and I think there may be opportunities we should discuss." He opened a folder and pulled out what appeared to be an organizational chart. "Based on our assessment this week, Golden Dragon is prepared to move forward with the partnership. However, we believe some significant changes will be necessary to make it successful." He showed me the chart, which outlined a restructured marketing department. My name was at the top, in a position labeled Marketing Partnership Coordinator, with reporting lines that bypassed Derek entirely and connected directly to Golden Dragon's management structure. "We believe this partnership requires someone who can bridge the cultural and linguistic gap between our organizations," he continued. "Your background and capabilities make you an ideal candidate for this role." I stared at the chart, trying to process what I was seeing. "What about Derek?" I asked. "And the rest of the team?" Mr. Chen's expression became more serious. "Mr. Mitchell's role would be eliminated in this structure. We believe his management style is not compatible with the kind of efficient operation this partnership requires. As for the rest of the team, we would retain the 4 people who contribute most directly to the actual work product." He handed me a document that outlined the proposed changes in detail. It was essentially a complete reorganization of our department, with me in charge of a smaller, more focused team, reporting directly to Golden Dragon's American Operations Manager. "The compensation for this position would be significantly higher than your current salary," he added, "and there would be opportunities for advancement within Golden Dragon's broader organization." I sat there holding the document, realizing that I was being offered Derek's job, essentially, plus a promotion and a significant raise. But it would mean being complicit in the elimination of half my colleagues' positions, including Derek's. "I need to think about this," I said finally. Mr. Chen nodded. "Of course. We'll be sending the formal partnership proposal to your executive team next week. If you're interested in this opportunity, you can contact me directly." He handed me his business card. "But I should mention that if you decline, we'll likely need to reconsider the entire partnership. You're really the only person in your department who has the qualifications we need for this role." After he left, I sat alone in the conference room, staring at the organizational chart and thinking about everything that had led to this moment. Derek was probably in his office right now, making plans for his expanded role in the partnership, completely unaware that he was about to lose his job. My colleagues were going about their normal Friday afternoon routines, not knowing that half of them would be laid off within the next few months, and I was holding documents that could either save my career or make me complicit in destroying the livelihoods of people I'd worked with for years. The weekend ahead was going to be very interesting. I spent that weekend in a state of complete mental turmoil. The organizational chart and job offer documents sat on my kitchen table like evidence of a crime I hadn't yet decided whether to commit. Every few hours, I'd pick them up and read through the details again, trying to convince myself that I was either making the right decision or about to make a terrible mistake. The position Golden Dragon was offering me was everything I'd worked toward for years. Marketing partnership coordinator with a salary that was nearly double what I was currently making, direct reporting to senior management, and genuine growth opportunities within an international company. It was the kind of career advancement that most people in my situation could only dream about. But it came with a price that kept me awake both nights. I'd have to sit quietly while Derek and 4 of my colleagues lost their jobs, knowing I could have warned them, but chose not to. By Sunday evening, I'd made my decision, though I wasn't entirely sure it was the right one. Monday morning arrived with Derek in an unusually good mood, even by his recent standards. He'd apparently spent the weekend researching Golden Dragon Industries more thoroughly and had convinced himself that the partnership was going to make him some kind of international business executive. "Jessica," he called out as I walked past his office, "can you come in here for a minute? I want to discuss some exciting developments." I sat down across from his desk, watching as he pulled out a legal pad covered with his handwriting and what appeared to be organizational charts of his own design. "I've been thinking about how we're going to structure the expanded operations," he began, "and I think there are some really interesting opportunities for everyone on the team." He launched into a 15-minute monologue about his vision for the partnership, complete with new job titles he'd invented for everyone, and responsibilities that bore no resemblance to what Golden Dragon had actually proposed. According to Derek's plan, he'd be overseeing a department of 12 people, with separate teams for different aspects of the Chinese market. "I'm thinking you'd be perfect for the cultural liaison role," he said, completely unaware of the irony. "You've got great attention to detail, and I think you'd be good at managing the day-to-day communications with the Chinese team." I nodded and made appropriate responses, all while thinking about the documents sitting in my briefcase that outlined a very different future for both of us. Tuesday brought the email everyone had been expecting. Patricia Holloway announced an all-hands meeting for Thursday afternoon to discuss exciting developments regarding our international partnership opportunities. Derek immediately started speculating that this would be the official announcement of the Golden Dragon partnership and his expanded role. What Derek didn't know was that I'd received a separate email from Mr. Chen, confirming that Golden Dragon's formal proposal had been submitted to Meridian Tech's executive team and asking if I'd made a decision about the position they'd offered me. I responded that I was still considering the opportunity and would let them know by the end of the week. It wasn't entirely true. I'd already made my decision, but I wanted to see how the official announcement played out before I committed to anything. Wednesday was when things started to get really interesting. Derek was called into a meeting with Patricia Holloway and the head of HR that lasted for over 2 hours. When he emerged, his expression was confused rather than triumphant, which should have been his first clue that something wasn't going according to his expectations. "How did the meeting go?" I asked when he returned to his office. Derek closed his door and sat down heavily in his chair. "It was different than I expected," he said slowly. "They wanted to discuss some aspects of the partnership that I hadn't anticipated." He paused, seeming to struggle with how to explain what had happened. "Apparently, Golden Dragon has some very specific ideas about how they want to structure the collaboration. Patricia mentioned that there might be some organizational changes required, but she was pretty vague about the details." I could see the first seeds of doubt starting to take root in Derek's mind, though he was still far from understanding the real situation. "Did they mention anything about timeline or next steps?" I asked. "They said we'd get more information at Thursday's meeting," Derek replied. "But Jessica, I have to admit, some of the questions they asked were unexpected. They wanted to know about my specific qualifications for managing international partnerships, and they asked a lot of detailed questions about the team's capabilities and structure." Derek was clearly trying to convince himself that these had been routine questions, but I could tell that something about the meeting had shaken his confidence. Thursday morning arrived with an atmosphere of anticipation throughout the office. Everyone knew that the all-hands meeting would finally provide concrete information about the Golden Dragon partnership and what it meant for the company's future. Derek spent the morning in his office with the door closed, presumably preparing remarks for what he assumed would be his moment of recognition. I could hear him practicing his presentation through the walls, rehearsing key phrases and statistics about the partnership's potential impact. The meeting was scheduled for 3:00 in the main conference room. By 2:45, everyone had gathered, and the energy was a mix of excitement and nervous anticipation. Derek positioned himself prominently near the front, clearly expecting to play a significant role in whatever announcement was coming. Patricia Holloway began with general remarks about the company's growth and the importance of strategic partnerships in expanding into new markets. She praised the marketing department's work on the Golden Dragon project and mentioned that the Chinese executives had been impressed with the professionalism and capabilities they'd observed. Derek was practically glowing with pride, nodding, along with every positive comment and occasionally glancing around the room to make sure his colleagues were witnessing his success. But then Patricia's tone shifted slightly. "However," she continued, "Golden Dragon has made it clear that moving forward with this partnership will require some significant operational adjustments on our part." She clicked to the next slide in her presentation, which showed a high-level organizational chart. "Effective immediately, we'll be implementing a new structure for our marketing operations that will better align with Golden Dragon's requirements and expectations." The chart showed a streamlined marketing department with 4 positions instead of the current 8. At the top was a position labeled Marketing Partnership Coordinator, with my name clearly visible beneath it. I heard Derek's sharp intake of breath and could see him staring at the slide with growing confusion and alarm. Patricia continued explaining the new structure, mentioning that the changes were necessary to optimize efficiency and eliminate redundancies in preparation for the expanded international operations. As she went through the details, it became clear that Derek's position had been completely eliminated from the organizational structure. His name didn't appear anywhere on the new chart, and the management responsibilities he'd assumed were his had been redistributed or eliminated entirely. Derek raised his hand, his voice slightly strained. "Patricia, I'm not seeing where my role fits into this new structure. Could you clarify how the management responsibilities will be handled?" There was an uncomfortable pause before Patricia responded. "Derek, I'd like to speak with you privately after this meeting to discuss your specific situation." The color drained from Derek's face as the implications finally began to sink in. He looked around the room, seeming to notice for the first time that several of his team members' names were also missing from the organizational chart. Patricia concluded the presentation by explaining that the changes would be implemented over the next month, with affected employees receiving appropriate notice and support during the transition. She emphasized that the partnership with Golden Dragon represented a significant opportunity for the company's growth, and that the organizational changes were necessary to ensure its success. After the meeting ended, Derek approached me with an expression that was equal parts confusion and desperation. "Jessica, did you know about this?" he asked quietly. "Did anyone say anything to you about these changes during your meeting with the Chinese executives?" This was the moment I'd been dreading and anticipating for days. I looked at Derek, this man who had spent years taking credit for my work, dismissing my contributions, and treating me like a subordinate whose opinions didn't matter. The man who had just spent the past week completely misreading a business situation that could have been easily understood if he'd bothered to actually listen instead of assuming his limited language skills made him indispensable. "Actually, Derek," I said, "there's something I need to tell you." I led him to an empty conference room and closed the door. Derek sat down across from me, his expression anxious and expectant. "The thing is," I began, "I've been able to understand everything the Chinese executives have been saying to each other for the past week. I'm fluent in Mandarin." Derek stared at me blankly for a moment, as if the words hadn't quite registered. "What do you mean, fluent?" "I mean, I understood every single conversation they had in Chinese during all those meetings, including the ones where they discussed eliminating your position and reducing the department size. They've been planning this restructuring since Tuesday." The blood drained from Derek's face as the full implications hit him. You understood them the whole time? And you didn't say anything?" "I didn't say anything to you," I corrected. "But I did have several conversations with them about the department's actual capabilities and structure. That's how I ended up with the coordinator position." Derek's expression shifted from confusion to anger. "So you've been plotting against me this whole week? Working behind my back to get my job?" "I haven't been plotting anything," I replied calmly. "I've been doing exactly what you hired me to do, analyzing the situation and positioning our department for success. The difference is that I actually understood what success looked like in this context." Derek stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. "This is unbelievable. You sat there in every meeting letting me make a fool of myself when you knew exactly what they were planning. You made a fool of yourself, Derek. I just didn't stop you." He stared at me for a long moment, clearly struggling to process not just the loss of his job, but the realization that his subordinate had been operating on a completely different level throughout the entire process. "How long?" he asked finally. "How long have you been able to speak Chinese?" "My entire life. My mother is Chinese American. I spent summers in Beijing during college. I've been fluent since I was a teenager." Derek sank back into his chair, looking defeated. "And you never mentioned this because it never seemed relevant to my job." "Until this week." We sat in silence for several minutes. I could see Derek working through the implications of everything I'd told him, realizing how completely he'd misunderstood not just the business situation, but his own employees' capabilities. Finally, he looked up at me with an expression that was equal parts resignation and bitter admiration. "So what happens now?" "Now you'll meet with Patricia and HR to discuss your severance package," I said. "And I'll start preparing for the transition to the new organizational structure." Derek nodded slowly, seeming to accept the inevitable. But then his expression hardened slightly. "You know," he said, "you could have warned me. You could have told me what they were really saying, given me a chance to adjust my approach." I considered this for a moment before responding. "You're right, I could have. But Derek, you've spent 4 years treating me like I was incapable of understanding complex business situations. You've taken credit for my work, dismissed my ideas, and made it clear that you saw me as nothing more than a competent assistant. Why would I go out of my way to protect someone who's never shown me that same consideration?" Derek didn't have an answer for that. As we sat there in the conference room, I realized that this moment represented more than just a career advancement for me. It was the culmination of years of being underestimated and undervalued, and the vindication of capabilities that had never been recognized or appreciated. The partnership with Golden Dragon was going to transform Meridian Tech's operations, but it had already transformed something more important, my understanding of my own value and potential. Derek eventually left the conference room to meet with Patricia, and I returned to my desk to begin preparing for the transition. But first, I sent a brief email to Mr. Chen, accepting the marketing partnership coordinator position and expressing my enthusiasm for the opportunities ahead. The real work was just beginning. The week following Derek's termination was surreal in ways I hadn't anticipated. Walking into an office where half the marketing department had been eliminated felt like navigating a ghost town. Empty desks, disconnected phones, and the conspicuous absence of Derek's constant commentary created an atmosphere that was both liberating and unsettling. My promotion to marketing partnership coordinator came with an office, Derek's old office actually, which felt like a strange twist of cosmic justice. As I moved my belongings into the space where Derek had spent years dismissing my contributions, I found myself reflecting on how dramatically circumstances could change when people finally saw your true capabilities. The transition wasn't entirely smooth. The 4 colleagues who remained in the restructured department, Marcus, Sarah, Jennifer, and David, were dealing with a complex mix of emotions. They were grateful to still have jobs, but they were also processing the loss of their teammates and the dramatic shift in departmental dynamics. Marcus, who had been with the company almost as long as I had, was the first to address the elephant in the room. He knocked on my office door Thursday morning, about a week after the restructuring announcement. "Jessica," he began, settling into the chair across from my desk, "I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me." I gestured for him to continue, though I had a feeling I knew what was coming. "Did you know this was going to happen? The layoffs, Derek getting fired, you getting promoted? Did you see any of this coming?" I'd been preparing for this conversation all week, knowing that my colleagues deserved some version of the truth, even if I couldn't share all the details. "I knew there were going to be changes," I said carefully. "The Chinese executives made it clear during the meetings that they had specific ideas about organizational structure, but I didn't know the exact details until the same announcement meeting everyone else attended." It wasn't entirely false, though it definitely wasn't the complete truth either. Marcus studied my expression for a moment. "But you must have had some indication, right? They didn't just randomly promote you to department head without some prior discussion. This was the tricky part. How do you explain that you'd been secretly understanding confidential conversations without making it sound like you'd been deliberately deceptive?" "Marcus, what I will tell you is that during my individual meeting with the Chinese executives, it became clear that they valued different qualities in a department head than what Derek represented. They were looking for someone with cultural awareness, language skills, and a more collaborative management style." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Language skills?" I realized I'd revealed more than I'd intended. "I speak Mandarin fluently. It's something I've never really had reason to mention at work before, but it became relevant during the partnership discussions." The surprise on Marcus's face was immediate and pronounced. "You speak Chinese? How fluent are we talking?" "Native. Level. My mother is Chinese American, and I spent time in Beijing during college." Marcus leaned back in his chair, processing this information. "So during all those meetings with the Chinese executives, I understood everything they said, both in English and Mandarin." There was a long pause as Marcus worked through the implications of this revelation. I could see him remembering specific moments from the meetings, probably wondering what conversations he'd witnessed without realizing their significance. "Did Derek know?" he asked finally. "Derek found out the same day he was terminated." Marcus let out a low whistle. That must have been quite a conversation. It was illuminating for both of us. Over the following days, word spread quickly through the remaining team about my language abilities. The reactions were mixed but generally positive. Sarah admitted she'd always wondered why the Chinese executives seemed to respond so well to me during the meetings. Jennifer mentioned that it explained why I'd seemed unusually confident during the partnership discussions. David, however, had a different perspective. He cornered me in the break room on Friday afternoon with a more direct question. "Jessica, I need to know, Did you deliberately sabotage Derek? His tone wasn't accusatory exactly, but it was serious enough to make me uncomfortable. David had been one of Derek's stronger supporters in the department, and I could tell he was struggling with the dramatic change in leadership. I didn't sabotage anyone, I replied. I did my job, which was to help make the partnership successful. The Chinese executives made their own decisions about organizational structure based on what they observed. But you had to know that Derek was completely misreading the situation. You could have warned him. This was the question I'd been asking myself repeatedly since the confrontation with Derek. Could I have handled things differently? Should I have? David, let me ask you something, I said. In the 4 years you've worked here, how many times have you seen Derek take advice from a subordinate? How many times has he acknowledged that someone else in the department might have insights he was missing? David didn't answer immediately, which was enough. Derek's management style was to assume he understood every situation better than anyone else, I continued. Even if I had tried to warn him, do you really think he would have listened? Or do you think he would have dismissed my concerns and told me to focus on my own responsibilities? David considered this for a moment before nodding reluctantly. You're probably right. Derek wasn't exactly known for taking feedback well. The conversation with David helped me solidify my own feelings about how everything had unfolded. I hadn't actively sabotaged Derek, but I also hadn't gone out of my way to protect him from his own incompetence. Given our history and his consistent dismissal of my capabilities, I felt comfortable with the choice I'd made. The real test of my new role came the following Monday, when Golden Dragon's American Operations Manager, Linda Chen, no relation to Mr. Chen from the Chinese delegation, arrived for a week-long transition planning session. Linda was a sharp, efficient woman in her early 40s who had been managing Golden Dragon's partnerships with American companies for the past 8 years. Our first meeting was scheduled for Monday morning, and I'll admit I was nervous. This was my first opportunity to prove that Golden Dragon had made the right choice in promoting me, and I knew that Linda's assessment would determine whether the partnership moved forward smoothly or hit significant obstacles. Linda arrived precisely, on time, and got straight to business. Ms. Parker, she began, I've reviewed the reports from our Beijing team about the partnership evaluation process. They were very impressed with your cultural awareness and business acumen. Thank you, I replied. I'm excited about the opportunities this partnership represents. Before we dive into the operational details, Linda continued, I want to address something directly. I understand there was some reorganization required to make this partnership work. I nodded, waiting to see where she was going with this. Eliminating half a department and terminating a department head is never easy, she said. But I want you to know that these decisions weren't made lightly. Golden Dragon has experience with partnerships where incompatible management styles derailed otherwise promising collaborations. Linda opened a folder and pulled out what appeared to be performance assessments from the previous week's meetings. Your former supervisor's approach to cross-cultural business was fundamentally incompatible with successful partnership operations, she explained. His assumption that basic language skills would compensate for lack of cultural understanding, combined with his tendency to take credit for subordinates' work, represented exactly the kind of obstacles we've learned to identify and address early in the partnership process. It was validating to hear an outside perspective confirm what I'd observed about Derek's limitations, but it also made me realize how carefully Golden Dragon had been evaluating every aspect of our department's operations. The question now, Linda continued, is whether you're prepared to manage a team and partnership relationship that will be significantly more demanding than what you've experienced in your previous role. Over the next hour, Linda outlined the expectations for the marketing partnership coordinator position. The responsibilities were extensive and genuinely challenging, managing marketing campaigns for both American and Chinese markets, coordinating with teams in Beijing and Shanghai, overseeing cultural adaptation of marketing materials, and serving as the primary liaison between Meridian Tech and Golden Dragon's marketing operations. The scope of work was intimidating, but it was also exactly the kind of challenge I'd been hoping for throughout my career. This wasn't just a promotion. It was an opportunity to use skills and knowledge that had never been properly utilized in my previous role. Linda also explained the broader context of the partnership. Golden Dragon was planning to use Meridian Tech as a template for similar partnerships with American companies, which meant our success or failure would influence their entire North American expansion strategy. "No pressure," Linda said with a slight smile, "but you're essentially piloting a business model that could determine Golden Dragon's approach to the American market for the next decade." By Wednesday, Linda and I had developed a detailed implementation plan for the marketing partnership. The structure she outlined was sophisticated and comprehensive, involving monthly strategy sessions with the Beijing team, quarterly reviews of campaign performance across both markets, and regular cultural consultation on marketing materials and messaging. What struck me most about working with Linda was how different her management style was from anything I'd experienced with Derek. She asked detailed questions about my ideas, built on my suggestions rather than dismissing them, and treated me as a genuine collaborator rather than a subordinate whose job was to execute her vision. During one of our planning sessions, Linda made a comment that really crystallized the difference between this opportunity and my previous role. "One of the things we value most in our American partners," she said, "is the ability to think independently while maintaining cultural sensitivity. We're not looking for people who just follow instructions. We need partners who can identify opportunities and challenges we might not see from our perspective." It was the first time in my professional career that a supervisor had explicitly valued my independent thinking, rather than seeing it as a potential problem to be managed. Thursday brought an unexpected development. Derek showed up at the office. Was in my office reviewing campaign materials when I saw him walking through the main work area, heading toward what used to be his office. Several of my remaining colleagues looked up in surprise, and I could see the confusion on their faces as they tried to figure out what he was doing there. Derek knocked on my office door and entered without waiting for permission, which was typical of his usual approach to boundaries. "Jessica," he said, "I need to talk to you." His appearance was disheveled in a way that suggested he'd been having a difficult week. His usual carefully maintained professional image had been replaced by wrinkled clothes and an expression that looked like he hadn't been sleeping well. "Derek," I replied carefully, "what are you doing here? I thought your access had been revoked." "I still have friends in security," he said dismissively. "Look, I've been thinking about our conversation last week, and I think there might be a way for us to work together on this Golden Dragon situation." I stared at him, genuinely confused about what he thought he was proposing. "Derek, you were terminated. Your position was eliminated. There is no us working together on anything." "But that's just it," he continued, sitting down across from my desk as if he still belonged there. "They eliminated my position, but they still need someone with my experience and industry connections. I've been doing some research on Golden Dragon's other partnerships, and I think I could consultant on the cultural integration aspects." The audacity of his proposal was breathtaking. Derek was essentially suggesting that I hire him as a consultant for the job he'd lost due to his complete misunderstanding of cultural integration. "Derek," I said slowly, "you do realize that the reason your position was eliminated was because Golden Dragon specifically didn't want to work with your management approach, right?" His expression shifted to the defensive posture I recognized from countless previous conversations. "That's not how I understand it," he said. "I think there were some communication issues and misunderstandings about my qualifications. If I could speak directly with their executives and clarify my experience." I realized that Derek still didn't fully comprehend what had happened during the partnership evaluation. Even after learning about my language abilities and his termination, he was still convinced that the problem was miscommunication rather than his fundamental incompetence. "Derek," I said firmly, Golden Dragon's executives understood your qualifications perfectly. They made a deliberate decision that your management style was incompatible with their partnership requirements. There were no misunderstandings. Derek's face flushed with anger and frustration. So you're not even willing to consider bringing me in as a consultant? After everything I did to mentor your career? That comment was the final straw. Mentor my career? I said, standing up behind my desk. Derek, you spent 4 years taking credit for my work, dismissing my ideas, and treating me like a glorified assistant. The only mentoring you provided was teaching me exactly what kind of manager I never want to become. Derek stood up abruptly, his face red with indignation. You know what, Jessica? I hope this partnership fails spectacularly. I hope Golden Dragon realizes they made a huge mistake putting an inexperienced coordinator in charge of a multi-million-dollar collaboration. And I hope you eventually develop enough self-awareness to understand why you lost your job, I replied calmly. Derek stormed out of my office, and I watched through the window as he made his way across the work area toward the exit. Several of my colleagues were openly staring, and I realized that this confrontation had provided them with additional clarity about the dynamics that had led to the departmental restructuring. Linda, who had witnessed the entire exchange from the conference room where she'd been working, approached my office a few minutes later. "Former supervisor?" she asked. "Former supervisor," I confirmed. Linda nodded thoughtfully. That kind of reaction reinforces our confidence in the organizational changes. People who can't accept responsibility for their professional failures rarely make good partners for complex international collaborations. As Derek disappeared from view, I felt a sense of closure about the entire situation. The partnership with Golden Dragon represented not just a career advancement, but a complete transformation of my professional environment. For the first time in years, I was working with people who valued my actual capabilities rather than seeing them as threats to their own authority. The real work was just beginning, but I was finally ready for it. 6 months into the Golden Dragon partnership, I received an email that made me smile in a way that felt like vindication and professional triumph rolled into one perfect moment. The message was from Patricia Holloway, our CEO, with the subject line, Q3 Partnership Performance. Review. Outstanding results. The email detailed metrics that exceeded every projection we'd made during the initial partnership discussions. Revenue from Golden Dragon collaborations had increased by 340% over the previous quarter. Client satisfaction scores were at an all-time high. Most importantly, Golden Dragon's executives had specifically requested to expand the partnership model to 3 additional American companies, using our collaboration as the template. But what made me smile wasn't just the numbers. It was the final paragraph of Patricia's email. Jessica, your leadership of this partnership has been exceptional. Golden Dragon's Beijing office has specifically commended your cultural competence and strategic vision. We're preparing a comprehensive review of your performance for consideration of advancement to Regional Marketing Director. Regional Marketing Director, a position that would put me 2 levels above where Derek had been, with oversight of marketing operations across Golden Dragon's entire North American expansion. I was reading Patricia's email when Linda Chen knocked on my office door, carrying a bottle of champagne and wearing the biggest smile I'd seen from her in 6 months. "Congratulations," she said, setting the champagne on my desk. "Beijing just approved the expansion proposal. We're moving forward, with partnerships in Chicago, Denver, and Portland, all using the operational model you developed." The success felt surreal. The marketing campaigns we'd created had resonated perfectly with both American and Chinese audiences, something that had never been achieved by any of Golden Dragon's previous American partnerships. Our team had developed a cultural adaptation process that maintained brand integrity while respecting local preferences, and the results had exceeded everyone's expectations. "There's something else," Linda continued, her expression becoming more serious. "Golden Dragon's board has made a decision about the North American expansion leadership structure." She handed me an official-looking document with golden dragons, corporate seal. We'd like you to consider the position of Director of North American Marketing Partnerships. It would be based here in Austin, but you'd oversee all of Golden Dragon's marketing collaborations across the United States and Canada. I stared at the document, reading through the job description and compensation package. The salary was more than Derek had ever made as department head, with stock options and performance bonuses that could potentially double my earnings. Linda, I said slowly, this is incredible, but I need to ask, what about my team here? Marcus, Sarah, Jennifer, and David have been essential to making this partnership work. Linda's smile widened. That's exactly the kind of response we hoped for. The director position comes with the authority to build your own team structure. You could bring your current colleagues with you into the expanded operations, promote them into leadership roles for the new partnerships. Over the next week, I had individual conversations with each of my team members about the expansion opportunity. Their reactions were unanimously enthusiastic, particularly when I explained that they'd all be getting significant promotions and salary increases as part of the new structure. Marcus would become the Chicago Partnership Coordinator. Sarah would head up the Denver operations. Jennifer and David would split responsibilities for the Portland partnership while training new team members for future expansions. Jessica, Marcus said during our conversation, I have to admit, when Derek got fired and you got promoted, I wasn't sure how it was going to work out. But you've created something here that's better than anything we had before. The transition to the new structure took about a month. Golden Dragon provided relocation assistance for team members who needed to move to their new cities, along with comprehensive training on the cultural adaptation processes we'd developed. The most satisfying moment came during a video conference with all the new partnership teams. Seeing my former colleagues leading their own operations, managing their own budgets, and developing their own strategic initiatives felt like validation of everything we'd built together. But the real vindication came from an unexpected source. It was in my new office, a corner space in Meridian Tech's newly renovated executive floor, when I received a LinkedIn message that made me do a double take. It was from Derek. Jessica, the message read, I wanted to reach out and congratulate you on your success with the Golden Dragon partnership. I've been following the news about the expansion, and it's clear that you've achieved something remarkable. I also wanted to apologize for how I handled our last conversation. I was angry and frustrated, and I said things I shouldn't have. I hope you'll accept my apology and my acknowledgement that you were clearly the right person for this opportunity. I stared at the message for several minutes, trying to decide how to respond. Part of me was tempted to ignore it entirely, but another part recognized that Derek's apology represented a level of self-awareness I hadn't thought he possessed. I wrote back, Derek, thank you for your message. I appreciate the apology and the congratulations. I hope you've found a position that's a better fit for your management style and career goals. His response came back within an hour. I have, actually. I'm working for a smaller company now where I can focus more on client relationships and less on team management. It's taught me a lot about my own strengths and weaknesses. I think I understand now why Golden Dragon made the decisions they did. Reading Derek's acknowledgement of his limitations felt like the final chapter of a story that had begun with me, sitting silently in meetings, understanding conversations that would change my career trajectory forever. The most rewarding aspect of my new role wasn't the salary or the title. It was the opportunity to build the kind of work environment I'd always wished for. Golden Dragon's management philosophy emphasized collaborative leadership, cultural competence, and genuine respect for diverse perspectives. It was everything Derek's management style had lacked. During our quarterly review meeting, Linda made a comment that perfectly captured why the partnership had been so successful. The difference between your approach and what we've experienced with other American partnerships, she explained, is that you understand that cultural competence isn't just about language skills or surface-level customs. It's about genuinely respecting different perspectives and finding ways to create value that works for everyone involved. A year after the initial partnership began, Golden Dragon invited me to Beijing for their annual North American Operations Conference. Standing in their corporate headquarters, presenting our expansion results to executives from across Asia, I thought about the journey that had brought me there. It had started with me sitting quietly in a conference room, listening to conversations that my boss couldn't understand, watching him misread a situation that would ultimately cost him his career. But it had led to opportunities I never could have imagined, and a professional environment where my actual capabilities were not just recognized, but actively developed. During my presentation to the Beijing executives, I used both English and Mandarin to explain our marketing strategies, and I could see the appreciation in their eyes for someone who could bridge cultural and linguistic gaps with genuine competence rather than superficial effort. After the presentation, Mr. Chen, the executive who had first offered me the coordinator position, approached me with a smile. "Ms. Parker," he said in Mandarin, "when we first met, we hoped you might be able to help us build one successful partnership. Instead, you've created a model that's transforming our entire North American strategy." "Thank you," I replied, also in Mandarin. "But I think the real success came from finally working with people who valued collaboration over control." He nodded thoughtfully. "That's a very American way of thinking about business relationships, but it's also exactly what makes these partnerships successful." Flying back to Austin, I reflected on how dramatically my career had changed because I'd had the courage to reveal capabilities that had been hidden and undervalued for years. The partnership with Golden Dragon had given me more than professional advancement. It had shown me what was possible when you worked with people who respected your actual potential rather than limiting you to their narrow perceptions of your abilities. 6 months later, I received a call from a headhunter representing a Fortune 500 company that was looking for a chief marketing officer with international partnership experience. The salary they offered was double what I was making with Golden Dragon, and the position would put me in charge of marketing operations across 12 countries. I turned it down. Not because the opportunity wasn't appealing, but because I'd learned something valuable about the difference between career advancement and career satisfaction. Golden Dragon had given me the chance to build something meaningful from the ground up, working with people who valued cultural competence and collaborative leadership. Sometimes the best revenge isn't just proving people wrong about your capabilities. It's building a career so fulfilling that their limitations become irrelevant to your success. Derek had spent years underestimating my potential and dismissing my contributions. But in the end, his inability to recognize talent had simply cleared the path for me to find people who could. And that, I realized, was the most satisfying outcome of all. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.